One Up Media.
It was April 24th, 2016. In central Vietnam, the turbulent waters of an industrial park in the Qui An district of Ha Tinh province looked normal on the surface. Beneath it, a group of divers took off for a routine mission. One of them was 46-year-old Levan Ne. Levan and 5 other professional divers jumped into the sea near the Vung Ang industrial zone in Qui An. As a seasoned diver, Levan had made countless trips in the seas of Ha Tinh, known for its rich marine life. This time, he will not be guiding tourists in the province's colorful underwater world. Instead, he joined construction workers assigned to complete the new breakwater for the deep water port in Vung Ang. But Levan did not know that this particular dive would tragically be his last. His assignment was to check the underwater structure of the breakwater, designed to protect coastal facilities from strong tidal surges. As he made his way deeper into the seas surrounding the Vung Ang industrial zone, neither he nor his team anticipated the perilous conditions they would encounter under the sea, where danger lurked in the form of industrial pollutants, invisible yet deadly. Levan and his fellow divers began to feel something unusual. With diving as his full-time job, he knew the seas of Qui An very well. But on this occasion, as they continued their journey underwater, an unexpected wave of exhaustion hit them. Then, Levan started experiencing severe chest pains and difficulty breathing. This sudden onset of symptoms forced the team to abort their mission and make a frantic scramble to the surface for air. Despite their swift return to land, the toxic water had already taken a devastating toll. The rush to save the divers was distressing, marked by the urgent wails of ambulance sirens and the clatter of wheels echoing across the hospital floors. Even after receiving medical attention, the exposure to the toxic chemicals in the water proved too much for Levan, and he succumbed to his symptoms later that day. His unexpected death thrust the Formosa spill into the national spotlight as Vietnam's worst marine life disaster. This catastrophic event, which would go on to claim several more innocent lives, ravaged a huge portion of the country's marine ecosystem. It would also destroy the livelihoods of thousands of locals and expose hundreds of locals and tourists to severe health risks. From One Up Media, this is Mass Murders. Ha Tinh province is a region situated on the north-central coast of Vietnam. Despite its rich cultural history and natural resources, Ha Tinh has long been considered among the poorer provinces. For decades, it has relied heavily on agriculture, and it struggled with challenges of modernization and limited industrial infrastructure. In the early 2000s, in an ambitious move to drive the local economy towards industrial growth and to reduce poverty, the Vietnamese government initiated the development of the Vung Ang industrial zone. With an area of over 20,000 hectares, equivalent to half of Singapore, it would transform Ha Tinh into a multi-sector economic powerhouse by attracting foreign investments like the Taiwanese multinational firm Formosa Plastics Group. Roads were laid, and factories began to rise from the ground up. Multinational and foreign companies were courted, including Formosa, which would have its own steel plant in Ha Tinh. Sure enough, environmental changes in Ha Tinh went unnoticed or sparked little concern at that time, as construction in the Vung Ang Industrial Park proceeded. One day, as a fisherman was wading through the waters of Qui An, he noticed workers laying down a pipe beneath the sea. This pipe would eventually be connected to the steel factory. However, It would take years for this undersea pipeline to resurface in public discourse. But when it did, it was under much grimmer circumstances. Fast forward a decade later, economic activity at the Vung Ang Industrial Park had already made significant progress, and business at the Formosa Plastics Group was booming. In 2016, the construction of their steel plant in Vung Ang, which was given the name Hong Nip Formosa Ha Tinh Steel Corporation, was nearing completion. That same year, on one sunny day on April 6th, a local diver ventured out to explore Khi An's vibrant marine ecosystem. One of the best things to do in Ha Tinh is to explore and visit its natural wonders, which attract hundreds of tourists every year. But today, something caught the diver's attention, prompting him to cut his dive short. Even with decreased visibility, he noticed a peculiar yellowish tint clouding the water. Intrigued and concerned, he followed the trail of discoloration. It led him to a large pipe, partially buried in the seabed. What he found next was alarming. A strange yellow substance was gushing out of it and into the sea. Concerned, the diver reported his findings to local authorities. He documented his discovery, and after investigating, revealed that the pipe was connected to the Formosa Ha Tinh Steel Corporation. On April 7, 2016, just a day after the disturbing discovery of the yellow liquid, another grave catastrophe began to unfold. In the small coastal villages of Hai Phong 1 and Hai Phong 2 in Khi An, local fishermen were about to wake up to a heartbreaking sight. The tides had come in, and just as they were getting ready to harvest their fish, they were greeted by an alarming scene. All of the fish in their fish pens went belly up. They watched in heartbreak as the groupers, which could fetch high prices in Khi An's wet markets, floated lifelessly on the surface. Their disappointment was only going to get worse, as more than 4,000 farmed fishes were found dead that day. On the other side of Ha Tinh province, a group of recreational and professional divers went about their day as usual. Eager to showcase the beauty and richness of Vietnam's marine ecosystems to tourists, they prepared for their dives with enthusiasm. Unaware of the grim news unfolding among the fishermen in Khi An, they set sail and continued with their trip out to sea. As they descended into the familiar depths, something was noticeably off. The water around them was different. It carried a bitter taste instead of the usual briny flavor of the sea. It was maybe just a subtle change, but for these seasoned divers, they knew for certain that something was unmistakably wrong. As they continued their dive, however, the unusual taste in their mouths became more pronounced, with one diver describing the sea as definitely weird that day. When they returned to shore, the divers discussed their observations, but as they shared their concerns with each other, a mysterious illness started to afflict them. Symptoms of nausea, headaches, and dizziness began to show, and they began to raise concerns about the water quality of Khi An's seas. Back in the Hai Phong communes of Khi An, experts continued to investigate the unusual mass deaths of their farmed fishes. They had assumed that this would be an isolated case in Khi An. However, it would soon spread to neighboring areas, impacting hundreds of fishing communities in central Vietnam. On April 8, 2016, across the neighboring provinces of Ha Tinh in the region, fishermen headed out to sea, casting their nets with hopes of a bountiful catch. But as the sun climbed higher, an unusual sight began to emerge on the shores. For more than 200 kilometers of the coastline, thousands upon thousands of dead fish began washing up on the beaches. The devastation can also be seen in the deeper parts of the sea, with the carcasses of small baitfish and even larger species covering the ocean floor. The scale of the disaster was catastrophic, with at least $50,000 worth of seafood washed ashore, contaminated and unfit for consumption. but many locals had no idea that the fish were poisoned. The crisis unraveling in central Vietnam's coasts happened so fast that hospitals in the region would soon be flooded with patients all complaining of the same sickness, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea after eating seafood. Unaware of the disaster unfolding in their seas, locals began to gather the dead sea creatures that washed ashore, collecting the barely alive ones and selling them at discounted prices to consumers. It seemed as though the sea gods had bestowed a blessing of abundance upon the local fishermen. But it would all appear too good to be true, because on April 19, 2016, a family from Quang Binh province had to rush their 8-year-old daughter to the hospital. After enjoying a meal with her family at a local restaurant, the girl suddenly began suffering intense headaches and diarrhea. As authorities looked into the case, they found out that the seafood served to her came from markets that were selling dead fish found on the shores. The government then had to advise the public to not eat any seafood, especially those sourced from the seas of central Vietnam. But unfortunately, it was too late. In the following days, hospitals filled rapidly as more cases emerged, with healthcare professionals working double time to attend to each patient. And every one of them recounted and shared similar symptoms after consuming what they thought was a safe meal. In light of the dire situation, the national government, as well as independent scientists, were tasked to take a deeper and closer look into the mystery. Initially, the Vietnamese government announced that the seas had been contaminated, but dismissed rumors of an unknown virus causing the disaster. Early investigations found that highly toxic chemicals present in the seas were to blame for the increase in cases of food poisoning. After thorough testing, scientists discovered elevated levels of chemicals such as phosphate, ammonium, and chromium in the water, particularly in the provinces that experienced the highest number of massive fish deaths. Meanwhile, a non-profit organization named Green Trees discovered that levels of phenol, a corrosive chemical, were 56 times higher in the seas of central Vietnam than normal. Some of the chemicals found in the seawater, such as phosphate, are harmless and considered essential nutrients. However, others such as chromium, ammonium, cyanide, and phenol are the exact opposite. These chemicals are harmful and extremely toxic, particularly phenol. When ingested, phenol can lead to severe and potentially life-threatening health effects. A person poisoned by phenol may suffer from severe abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, and possibly bloody diarrhea. Without prompt medical attention, ingestion of phenol can be fatal. Scientists also came to the realization that the chemical substances found in the water could be attributed to a single source, as they are typically associated with industrial waste. Now, the only question was, where were they coming from? When the diver Levon passed away on April 24, 2016, approximately 3 weeks after the first wave of mass fish deaths appeared on the shores of Ha Tinh province, doctors continued their search for answers to his mysterious death. A few days later, 3 more individuals from the central Vietnam region died under eerily similar circumstances. Doctors discovered that coincidentally, all 3 victims had consumed fish harvested from the seas hours before their untimely demise. Shortly thereafter, another group of divers went underwater, but their trip was cut short when they complained of exhaustion and difficulty breathing. Suspicions began to center on the Vung An industrial zone, particularly the Formosa steel plant. However, it would take weeks, stretching into months, before the truth would emerge. And the people of Vietnam would soon realize that holding a massive company like Formosa accountable would prove to be a tough battle. On April 25, 2016, Amid reports of locals falling ill from eating seafood, beachgoers in Quang Binh province still enjoyed the sun. Despite rumors and concerns about toxic chemicals in the sea, the waters seemed safe for swimming and frolicking. Both adults and children, eager to enjoy the summer weather, spent their time playing on the beaches and cooling off in the refreshing waters, seemingly oblivious to the underlying environmental issues surrounding them. But that all came to an end on April 26, 2016. As the scale of the disaster unfolded, with marine life dying in vast numbers, the government faced a critical decision. Public health and safety were at stake. On a day marked by urgent meetings and consultations, authorities announced a sweeping ban not just on swimming, but also fishing in the affected areas. This was not a decision taken lightly. The ocean, which serves as the livelihood for thousands of Vietnamese, was now off limits. The toxic aftermath of the disaster left waters barren, rendering fishing grounds desolate and local fishermen reeling in the economic turmoil. Fishing boats sat idle, their anchors holding them in place as the once bustling activity on the water came to a standstill. And overnight, beaches once alive and teeming with people became deserted stretches of sand, cordoned off with warning signs. On land, the bustling seafood markets turned into quiet, ghost towns. In the meantime, the government continues to grapple with the extent of contamination, with water samples revealing alarming levels of hazardous chemicals like ammonium and cyanide. Moreover, the ban imposed immediate hardships on fishermen whose livelihoods depend on the sea. With the waters contaminated by dangerous chemicals, fishing became not only unfeasible, but also perilous. Furthermore, the presence of high levels of toxic substances not only deprived fishermen of their income, but also raised concerns about long-term health risks associated with consuming contaminated seafood. As weeks turned into months, the government scrambled to address the crisis and its economic fallout. Compensation schemes were established, but the aid, amounting to 40,000 Vietnamese dong, or roughly $2 per fisherman, offered little relief to those affected. The fishing communities in central Vietnam could do nothing. Their only option now was to wait for the sea to heal itself and to hope they could soon return to the waters and resume fishing. Back in Kỳ An, where the wave of massive fish deaths first occurred, suspicions began to turn to the Formosa Plastics Group, whose steel plant loomed large over the province. The Formosa Plastics Group is a major conglomerate headquartered in Taiwan. In 2008, they decided to erect a large iron and steel making plant in Ha Tinh, spending a total of $10.5 billion. The plan, named the Hung Nip Formosa Ha Tinh Steel Corporation, would help transform Kỳ An into a thriving industrial zone, generating over 35,000 jobs for the locals. It would go on to become one of the largest steel manufacturers in Vietnam, but later on, the country's biggest violator of environmental regulations. Upon hearing news of dead fish piling up on the coast of central Vietnam, the government discreetly dispatched teams of investigators to conduct random inspections on several industrial plants, one of them being the Formosa Steel in Kỳ An. Their mission was to find out if the vast amounts of toxic substances they found on the seas came from these factories or industrial plants. In mid-April 2016, government scientists and inspectors unexpectedly arrived at the gate of Formosa Steel in the Vung Ang industrial zone. But the security guards manning the company's grounds were not expecting them. Immediately, they alerted the plant officials, who then informed management and higher-ups at Formosa Steel. Eventually, the group was denied entry into the plant, and the guards had no choice but to ask them to leave. Word of Formosa's refusal to allow a surprise inspection by the government quickly spread, and suspicions surrounding the industrial conglomerate started to grow. However, locals in Kỳ An were not surprised to learn about this development, as they had long believed that the harmful chemicals that poisoned their sea came from the steel plant. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence was the discovery of Formosa Steel's pipeline buried in the seabed, discharging a strange yellowish chemical into the sea. Meanwhile, executives and officials in Formosa had to address not just one, but two crises at hand. The first being the accusations hurled against them as the company responsible for dumping toxic chemical waste into the sea, which itself constituted a significant violation of Vietnam's environmental laws. The second issue involved a communication breakdown that resulted in public backlash. While Formosa denied any wrongdoings and claimed to have complied with environmental regulations, an official's strongly worded statement became the subject of criticism and outrage. Mr. Chu Xuan Pham, then deputy head of Formosa's External Relations Department, strongly defended Formosa from unofficial reports linking the company to the ecological disaster in central Vietnam. However, his response only fueled further criticism of Formosa. In his statement, he said, "Do you want to keep fishing or do you want to keep the plant? Go ahead and make your decision. If you want both, even the Prime Minister can't satisfy you." Not mincing his words proved to have consequences for Mr. Chu, because after this, he had to issue a public apology and was subsequently fired from his post. On April 26th, Formosa finally allowed a team of inspectors from the Ministry of Industry and Trade to inspect their site in the Vung Ang Industrial Zone. The inspection came 4 days after the ministry issued a so-called most urgent notification, telling Formosa they would be reviewing their environmental practices. Every aspect of the Formosa steel plant was examined, including the large pipeline that appeared to extend into the sea. Spanning over a kilometer in length and close to a meter in diameter, this pipe was the same one the locals in Kỳ An discovered previously. Formosa confirmed that the pipe was part of their drainage system, but like before, they denied that it had anything to do with the poisoned seas of central Vietnam. However, doubts about whether or not Formosa was telling the truth began to mount at this point. On April 27th, 20 days after the massive fish deaths first came to light, the Vietnamese national government officially confirmed that the seas in the central region had indeed been contaminated. They found two possible causes behind the environmental disaster. One pointed to the effects of an abnormal natural phenomenon like a red tide. The other theory involved toxic chemicals, particularly industrial wastes, being discharged directly into the sea. Most, if not all, did not believe the red tide explanation, and once again, all eyes turned to Formosa Steel in Ha Tinh province. But the corporation maintained its innocence and dismissed all rumors. As April ended and May began, the true source behind the destruction of central Vietnam's marine life remained unknown. Thirsty for justice, fed up with explanations filled with technical jargon, and frustrated with vague answers, thousands of Vietnamese took to the streets and demanded an explanation. Soon, Vietnam would turn into a battleground not just against environmental tragedies, but also a stage for fierce and divisive societal clashes that threatened the government's stability. On one hand, local fishermen, non-profit organizations, independent journalists, and experts demanded accountability for the environmental damage. On the other, bloggers and influencers visited Ha Tinh province to showcase its beaches, try out seafood, and minimize worries about pollution in their columns and blogs. This was an outright PR campaign aimed to counter the widespread claims of contamination and calm the storm that was brewing. As May dragged on, more and more citizens, from weary fishermen to furious residents, joined in the protests. This time, their rallies were addressed to Formosa. The government's initial report, stating they found no evidence linking Formosa to the disaster, further enraged the general public, leading authorities to use force to suppress their anger. Police crackdowns resulted in countless arrests and injuries, including a mother who hugged her child during a chaotic protest in Hanoi, only to be kicked in the face by authorities. Even ordinary citizens faced brutal suppression, like a couple of bystanders arrested for sharing rally footage on social media. As tensions escalated, international attention grew, and the United Nations was forced to intervene. On May 13th, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights issued a statement expressing concerns over the disturbing pattern of arbitrary arrests and detentions in Vietnam. This forced the Vietnamese government to take action. And now, faced with internal pressure and international scrutiny, things began to shift. On June 30th, they organized another press conference. But this time, rumors as to who poisoned the seas of central Vietnam would finally be put to rest. In Hanoi, the country's Minister of Natural Resources and Environment revealed that the chemicals responsible for the destruction of marine life in its 4 provinces had indeed originated from the Formosa Steel Corporation, and it all began with the pipeline buried in the seabed. So how did it happen? When local divers discovered the pipeline on April 6, 2016, the Formosa Steel plant in Ha Tinh had been undergoing wet cooking, a process involving the conversion of coal into coke using water and high temperatures. It's also a process used primarily in the treatment of wastewater. In particular, treating complex industrial wastewater that contains high levels of organic pollutants. Through high temperatures and pressures, complex organic compounds used to manufacture resources like steel will be broken down into simpler forms. However, environmental experts advised against the practice of wet cooking due to its higher pollution levels and increased emissions into the air. Additionally, improper disposal of its byproducts, including toxic chemicals, can lead to disastrous consequences, as seen in the seas of central Vietnam. The yellow-colored chemicals being discharged by the pipeline of Formosa Steel were indeed the untreated byproducts of the plant's wet cooking process, and it contained high levels of cyanide and phenol. These are extremely poisonous substances, and small amounts can be fatal. After claiming responsibility, the Formosa Plastics Group paid the Vietnamese government around $500 million to rehabilitate the seas in central Vietnam. But money wasn't the main concern. It was time. Experts estimate that it will take at least 50 to 70 years for marine life to recover from the devastation. As the summer of 2016 drew to a close in Vietnam, it seemed like the dust had settled, and the Vietnamese people felt they had finally found closure. But none of them saw what was coming next. One morning, on the picturesque coast of Quang Tri, some of the top officials from Vietnam's central provinces took a dip in the sea. Later that day, they indulged in seafood at a nearby restaurant, all the while being heavily documented by the Vietnamese press, eager to capture this symbolic moment of resilience and renewal. They represented the face of a new era for central Vietnam, as the government sought to portray an image of healing and recovery after the devastating environmental destruction last April. This would have been the perfect conclusion to a heartbreaking environmental crisis, but the story didn't end there. 3 years later, on the opposite side of the world, authorities in England made a chilling discovery: an abandoned refrigerated lorry containing 39 frozen bodies. All of the victims were Vietnamese nationals, and upon further investigation, they were illegal immigrants, just 39 desperate souls looking for better opportunities to improve their livelihoods. Adding to the tragedy, police discovered that some of the victims hailed from Ha Tinh, once again bringing the province into the spotlight as a painful reminder of the 2016 marine life disaster. The toll of the environmental disaster rang far and wide, but more importantly, the actions of the Formosa Steel Corporation led to what can only be described as an act of mass murder in Vietnam. Mass Murders is a One-Up Media original. A quick word on our reenactments and dramatizations. While we can't know exactly what they say, think, or feel at the moment, it is all based on research. This episode was executive produced by Quang Jin, produced and written by Ethan Sam, edited by Alex, narrated by Jason, audio experience by Ethan Sam, with additional engineering by Ashley from One Up Media. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.